I tell you one thing, it's always better when we're together.
Hi, I'm Reverend Carissa Surber.
And I'm Matthew Surber.
And this is our video series, Better Together, where we're taking all the things we've learned from marriage and education and our different careers, and we're bringing it all into church world and seeing how these ideas can teach us how to love each other well. So what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about incarnational listening. And you may remember that we previously talked about active listening.
Right, assertive communication, active listening.
Right, where you're like seeking to engage that conversation and really allow them to unpack stuff. Incarnational listening sort of takes it a step farther. And it's this idea that we're listening to understand. We're not condoning anything we're hearing. This incarnational listening isn't necessarily about like, oh, I agree that you did that, so much as it is like allowing the person to really express their needs, wants, feelings, and understanding why a thing happened. If I was going to talk about it in sort of a behavioral context, it's the idea that like, I can't move forward with someone until I really kind of understand them and I understand their thought process and kind of how they got from point A to point B. And incarnational listening is really kind of creating that space for that kind of a conversation to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And so you can see where this would be really helpful in a one-on-one setting and interpersonal relationship. But also, would you say this is helpful when we're trying to talk about tough issues across really big divides?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime that you can allow someone sort of unfettered capacity to speak and to talk and to share without feeling like they're going to get shut down or they're going to get a quick response or that, you know, people in the room are just sort of judging them for what happened, then you create the sort of invitational space for them to really occupy and kind of share really who they really are as opposed to who they think they have to be in front of us.
Yeah, it really gets at that sense of I and thou, right? I'm recognizing that you are a full human, and I'm treating you as such. You're not just like a straw man argument. Yeah,
absolutely.
So we gave this a fancy title, Incarnational Listening. And this title, full disclosure, comes from our August book club pick by Rich Villodas, where he talks about the deeply transformed life. And one of the practices he talks about in that book that helps us to bridge, especially in terms of racial reconciliation, he talks about incarnational listening. So in case you aren't up on your theology, incarnation is the word that refers to how God became flesh in Jesus Christ so that we would know Jesus in person, right? John 1:14, the word became flesh and lived among us. That's the incarnation. That's what the word incarnation means, is the word became flesh and lived among us. And so God literally left where God was most comfortable and came outside of that experience to try to be with us as humans, to understand us as humans, to express God's self to us as humans. Philippians 2, there's that Christ hymn in Philippians 2:5 says, though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not regard equality with God as something to be abused or to be taken advantage of, but instead he took on the form, he lowered himself. He took on the form of flesh and lowered himself, even becoming crucified. And so every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And so there's that downward movement, right? Coming out of heaven down to us. Now, when I'm talking to somebody else, obviously I'm not like looking down on them. But the idea here is that in incarnational listening, just as Jesus left his throne, essentially, he left his throne, but he kept who he was while also meeting people where they were. That's incarnational listening, right? So like if Matthew and I, just as an example, had totally opposite perspectives on something, I can hold on to my perspective and say like, I'm gonna bench that here. I'm still me. I'm not abandoning my perspective, but I can set that aside long enough to ask you questions and to try to understand like, where's this coming from? Some questions that I find really helpful in incarnational listening are like, oh, when did this idea come to you? Oh, where's that coming from? I never thought of it that way. Who told you about that? Oh, why is that so important to you? Like all of these who, what, when, where, why, how questions, they just kind of help to unpack a little bit of like, where are these ideas coming from? And often we find that underneath all the layers we really have some sort of common ground under it all. And so incarnational listening, we do it not just because empathy is good, which it is.
Sure,
Empathy is good.
yeah.
But incarnational listening is really, we do it because it's what Jesus did. Jesus took the time, Jesus built relationships of trust, and Jesus bridged divides by being really, really present. The Gospel of John talks about how Jesus did these miracles, these signs, and then it says, and he abides, and there was where he abode. He stayed there, it says, and he stayed there for a number of days. And so whenever Jesus came into a town, he would stay there. He'd stay with the people to really build those relationships of trust and do that incarnational work. So that's incarnational listening. And we hope that will help you in your personal relationships, but also in these fraught times to help bridge divides. When you find yourself saying, how in the world could you think that? Pause and step back. And we challenge you to try it. Try some incarnational listening and asking those big questions.
All right. Folks, until next time, love God, love your neighbor, and remember that we are better together.